Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show with good news. The S&P 500, good news. And I welcome Thaddeus McCotter, my colleague, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes. And Thaddeus has praise of good news. The senior member of the Michigan delegation, the House of Representatives, perhaps the senior member of the House of Representatives, I don't have that fact in front of me, John Dingell, has announced his retirement from Congress this year. Thaddeus, my memory is that you've long admired John Dingell. Is that correct?
Yes, and he was very helpful to me throughout my years in Congress to understand the institution, the rules, both written and unwritten. And when the time came to represent the people of Michigan, there was no party, there was only cooperation.
He is the son, I believe. He's the descendant of a member of Congress, and so Dingell's been in Congress for 300 years, a little more than there's been in the United States of America. What does it mean to lose the senior member of a delegation? Does that put people at sea? Is there some sense of hierarchy or a priority when you're senior?
No, but I think that especially over time, both Republicans and Democrats came to view Congressman Dingell as a font of information, as a resource to draw upon. He was very good about that. He obviously was the longest serving member of the United States House of Representatives in its history. And one of the things that he loved was the institution itself. And he wanted to make sure, especially in his later years, that individuals who were going to be there after him had a very good understanding of how to try, at least, it's not always been successful, to keep the institution vibrant and working on behalf of the American people.
Are you sorry that he's leaving? Do you think it's time to go, or should he have stayed in his post?
Well, I've always respected the individual member's decision. It's not about whether we think it's good for them, it's what they think is good for them. And after someone who has given decades of service to the people of Michigan and America, it's John's decision as to when he feels he can no longer serve up to the standard by which he has always held himself.
John Dingell retiring, announcing his retirement. He will not stand for re-election in 2014 in the seniority of his years. We welcome Aaron Task, who is the editor-in-chief of the Daily Ticker and Yahoo Finance, and also the host of the Daily Ticker at Yahoo Finance, because Aaron has fresh news today. John Dingell departs on a day in which the stock market is celebrating close to a near-time, all-time high. Aaron, good evening to you. What does it mean that the S&P 500 came very close to a record? What does that say for America's promise right now? Good evening to you.
Good evening. Well, if the stock market is a barometer of the health of corporate America, the S&P 500 being at a new all-time high means that corporate America is in really great shape. And that's probably not a surprise to a lot of your listeners. The question is whether the rest of us are in any good shape, and that's where the divide is starting to get bigger and bigger. Is that the corporate world's doing fantastic, and the average American is not doing so great.
Thaddeus?
Yes, Aaron, glad to be with you again. It reminds me of the Robert Kennedy speech that the gross national product doesn't necessarily measure what it's like to be an American or the happiness of the citizenry. It was something Ronald Reagan himself echoed. How should people view this? People who are struggling, people who are looking for work, people who are worried about paying the bills. What does this mean to them?
Well, I wish I had some great news to impart upon them, that this is a sign that corporations are going to start to hire en masse and the jobs market's going to improve dramatically. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. I think, especially in this moment in time, corporations are being rewarded for doing things like buying back their stock or increasing their dividends or buying out a competitor and then cutting jobs. They are not being rewarded by the street for expanding and hiring. And so the good news is that a lot of Americans own stock through their 401ks or directly through mutual funds or direct investments, and so their bottom line is better as the stock market does well. But for the millions of Americans who are out of work or underemployed, I'm afraid there isn't a whole lot of great news here.
Is this the Federal Reserve speaking one more time, Aaron? The easy money, Janet Yellen continuing Mr. Bernanke's policies?
I think that's definitely part of it, and I think that's been a big part of this last leg of the rally last week or so after Janet Yellen's first congressional testimony. I would also note, and this wasn't even talking about that much on the street today, but the G20 met this past weekend, and there was a lot of talk about more infrastructure spending and more central bank support for developed economies, which means more action by the Fed and the European Central Bank in an attempt to stimulate the economies, will keep rates very low and do other things that are very good for the financial markets.
Thaddeus?
Aaron, Henry Ford had the theory that actually proved in practice that it was rather good theory, was that if you paid people enough to buy the products that they made, you would have prosperity. So from some of the stuff that we're hearing then, relating back to my previous question for how are unemployed people and other people struggling is supposed to view this news, what you're hearing is that the corporations are rewarded for less hiring and will be rewarded for actually reducing their payrolls. And that's not going to bode well for consumer spending. It's not going to bode well for any type of generation of long-term sustainable prosperity, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think we've talked a lot about Henry Ford and the model that he used, and when he raised wages during the Depression to $5 an hour, and it was a huge thing for his workers, and sort of pleading corporations to think about that today. But the difference is that corporations today don't think about just American workers and American consumers. They have consumers all over the world, and probably more importantly, they have the option of employing people all over the world who will work for a lot less than even the minimum wage in this country. And the ease of capital flowing around the world has made it, again, very good for corporations, not so great for the average American worker. Now, look, you talk to economists, and they'll say, well, there's tens of millions, hundreds of millions of Chinese who've risen out of abject poverty because of this, and that's true, but that doesn't help somebody in your old district or around the corner from me in New Jersey or anywhere else in America who used to have a job that he or she could afford to support a family on, and now they have no job, or they're working two jobs just to almost make ends meet.
Well, if I can just jump in there, because what it sounds like is the old theory of a economy as a pie, where one piece goes here and it goes from one person. That means somebody's going to go hungry, as opposed to the ever-expanding pie. When you see individuals, employees pitted against each other around the world, some of them who do make less than the minimum wage, that can't afford the products that the company makes or other companies make. And so you start with a zero-sum game as opposed to the expanding pie theory.
I think that's a great way to look at it. I think it has become a zero-sum game. And hopefully there's an end to that game where corporations will realize that we need somebody to actually buy our products. And there certainly are companies that are domestically focused in this country, like home builders. They need people to buy their products, right? And so they are a great example of a company that hires, and that stimulates economic activity. And the people that they hire, people in the construction field, typically will go out and spend that money, stimulate more economic growth. So it still happens in pockets of the economy. It's just not what drives the overall economy anymore.
Detail, Aaron, about the consumer class. Netflix cut a deal with Verizon. This has to do with net neutrality. It's a long-standing fight. 30% of the internet traffic right now is Netflix. Is this a positive for the market?
I don't know if it's a positive for the market. It certainly is a sign of how important Netflix has become and how huge Comcast is becoming with this deal with Time Warner. If that deal goes through, about 40% of all broadband users in this country will be Comcast consumers. So they're going to have tremendous power and influence over who gets what and how quickly they get it on the internet. And
Netflix didn't need to make that deal with Comcast, right? They volunteered to do this. They could have.
The important thing is that Netflix has already been paying for that access. They've been paying middlemen, and now they're going directly to Comcast. And maybe it actually saves them money in the long term. We don't know the financial terms of that deal yet.
Aaron Task, who's the editor-in-chief and the host of the Daily Ticker. He's the editor-in-chief of Yahoo Finance each day. Thaddeus McCotter at WJR in Detroit. I'm John Batchelor.